So in Iran, on International Women's Day, March 8th, 1979, women had mobilized to denounce new forms of gender discrimination before they were enshrined into law. And these are, of course, some of these iconic, famous images of those days of mass demonstrations and sit-ins that unfolded that week. These women rightly understood that the restrictions on women's clothing, the announcement from Khomeni that women would have to wear hijab in government offices, that women couldn't be judges, some of these kinds of things that the government was starting to say. These women in the streets, they understood that those attacks on women were part of a broader curtailment of freedom and part of a reneging of promises of equality more broadly. So based on my close reading of the French feminist documentary about the uprising, which is called Iranian Women's Liberation Movement Year Zero, and on other speeches and documents that were produced by women's organizations coming out of these days of protests, as well as the personal memories of some participants who I interviewed, returning ISA members who I interviewed, I argue that this was the moment when the revolutionary affects of tens of thousands of Iranian women who had been actually part of the revolution diverged from all of the major existing organizations and ideologies across the political spectrum, with almost very few exceptions, really. This divergence cannot accurately be understood through the binary logics of the West versus Islam or secular versus Islam that too often shape the current era of US-Iran relations. And that too often distort feminism into a pro-US interventionist position. In fact, there was remarkable agreement in March 79 among the secular left, the liberal nationalists, and the Islamists that women's rights were at best a distraction and at worst a Western conspiracy to weaken the revolution. And the women here, they were not marching against Islam in general or against hijab in general. They were marching against the state enforcing second-class citizenship on women in the form of mandatory hijab and denying women full agency over their bodies and full access to all of the avenues of employment and education and full participation in the society, right? So because revolutionary affects are embedded within power relations and emerge in response to them, the lived experiences of gender and sexual oppression in society and within revolutionary movements had the power to unleash new political orientations. This dynamic was actually part of revolutionary anti-colonial movements all over the world. And I find it very helpful to see Iran not as some sort of tragic exception wrenched out of historical time by the rise of a Shiite theocracy, but as an example of similar conflicts between national liberation and women's liberation, between anti-imperialism and democracy, right, that were playing out globally, each in a particular local context. In the context of the Iranian Revolution, we can see how an intersectional approach to anti-imperialism emerged from within the revolutionary movement itself. When these tens of thousands of women took to the streets in March, they were protesting multiple overlapping forms of oppression: the Western imperial domination over Iran, the Shah's dictatorship, and new forms of authoritarianism enacted in the name of Islam. They understood it was impossible for Iranian women to be free unless all forms of domination were dismantled. Their demands were not legible within the hierarchical mode of revolutionary politics that dominated at the time, the primary versus secondary, right?